how does the interpretation of Scripture contribute to the project of a biblical philosophy? Those biblical hermeneutics contribute to Christian philosophy?
So yeah, I was hoping you were going to skip over this question, because this is a doozy, as they say in American English. It's a big one. So I think there's a more recent, what they call the theological interpretation of Scripture movement, that has a lot of compatibility with what I'm thinking about here. I have a lot of friends who work in that movement. I'm hedging a little here, because I think, and this is true in Brazil, because I've taught in seminaries in Belo Horizonte before, so I know what they teach. There does tend to be this kind of hermeneutic that is essentially geared towards interpreting passages in books. So there, we're trying to interpret what the Sermon on the Mount is all about, right? And we can think about that separately than Matthew's whole project, even though we have to incorporate Matthew's thinking. But essentially, we just want to know about the prologue or something in the Sermon on the Mount, or I'm trying to interpret the meaning of this parable. And everything is so interconnected, and I think this has changed in the last 20 to 30 years. Scholars are now starting to see what they call the intertextuality, the interconnectedness of all of these texts, so that it really is difficult to understand anything in Mark's gospel if you don't understand what's going on in Deuteronomy and Isaiah and Exodus and certainly Ezekiel at the very least. And any attempt to say this is what's going on in Mark's transfiguration account without accounting for that string of thinking from the Torah and through the prophets is now kind of considered short. It's not a good enough account if you can't connect those ideas together. So I think the fundamental hermeneutical shift that has happened is seeing the interconnectedness of concepts and language, and especially when language and concepts overlap with one another, and seeing how those are being used by various biblical authors for different reasons, but that later biblical authors understand those layers of meaning and are employing those layers of meaning for their own purposes as well.
Very nice. In this sense, we need to pay more attention to biblical theology,
yes,
for example, than these kind of hermeneutics, very, very punctual, very circumscript to one passage, than the biblical theology for the book, for the letter, for the portions of the Bible. In this sense, for biblical philosophy, the biblical theology it's needs our attention.
Yes, and I wonder if a lot of this kind of looking passage by passage interpretation comes from just the need. A lot of pastors, they go through seminary and then they learn how to preach week after week after week, and it's one passage this week, the next passage next week, and I just need to be able to interpret each passage as I go along the way. And my advice to students now who don't know the Bible very well, I say don't go into a passage and try to figure it out. Read the Gospel of Matthew 4 times on Saturday in a row. Just read the whole thing 4 times in a row, and you will know more about what Matthew is up to after 4 times of reading. You'll have better questions for the Gospel of Matthew than if you tried to go passage by passage by passage.
This characteristic of Hebrew style of philosophy, it's networked. The whole argument developed by the whole text, the whole book in the Bible. It's a mark of Hebrew style. Is okay?
Yes, I think it's one of the unique features of Hebrew philosophy, and it has to be unique to the Hebrews because they're the only group of people that has contiguous writing where they're actually trying to lay out a singular history of one people. And you might think, well, wait, didn't the Egyptians believe themselves to be one people? But actually, Egyptians, as I talk about in the book, have a very different sense of time, a very different sense of history and story. Some people go as far to argue that the Hebrew Bible is the first place you actually get something that we would call history, that has a definitive beginning, middle, and end to it as well. And whether they were the first to invent the historical narrative or whatever people want to argue, it doesn't matter. That's certainly how the biblical text, they unroll before us as one big story, which means that every later story is going to be referencing an early story or depending upon one in a unique way in which a funerary text in Egypt does not have to. And the same thing with, if you want to think about the various versions of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, they don't have to depend on earlier versions in the same way that the Hebrew Bible does, especially when these texts are collected and set right next to each other every time that they're read.
Fantastic. Thank you for the answers.